Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Coffee and Geography podcast. Now, this is a bit of an unusual espresso and coffee. And those of you who are fans of the podcast, you'll know that espresso and geography is usually a 15-minute snippet of current affairs. I have a feeling, Alistair, that this is going to be more than 15 minutes. So,
Yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
think we have a tendency to be more than 15 minutes anyway, Kit,
you
but I
do.
think the
Yeah,
topic
yeah.
we're going to talk about is certainly going to lend itself to that today, I think.
Yeah. So, right. Okay, folks. So what the current affairs is, and actually we're recording this on the day that I am releasing it, right? Because you probably have, if you've been waiting for the Coffee and Geography episode to drop this morning, like it normally would, you're probably thinking, where is it? You know, we're recording this now at 4:15 in the afternoon, and so we're going to record this, do a bit of editing, and this is going to be out later tonight. Okay. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this issue, right? So, this week the UK schools are facing an unusual challenge: extreme heat, record breaking for June, and a very public debate about whether classrooms should stay open. So what's interesting here, actually, folks, is it isn't just a question of temperature, right? I mean, this is a geography podcast. We could talk about temperature, but we're very nuanced as geographers, aren't we? So it also reveals about how we understand risk, how we understand resilience, and the changing climate in everyday spaces like schools. So I was on Teacher Talk Radio early on the week, well, yeah, in the evening. And it was, I just want to say thank you to Tom Rogers, the host, and Teacher Talk Radio for having me on in that panel. I don't usually do radio stuff for many reasons, but because of my expertise and my experience, I thought this was an invitation that I couldn't turn down, right? So what Alistair and I are going to be talking about is not necessarily about who was right, but instead, what does this debate really tell us about how society adapts or struggles to adapt, right? To things like heat waves and environmental change. So my plan is that whereas you can watch or put the link to the full chat in the description, I strongly encourage for the whole entire nuance, if you get the chance to listen to it during a commute or while you're cooking dinner or something like that, I strongly recommend you do it, because valid points were made by everybody, and there was a lot of nuance, but the debate kind of drifted away really from what I would like to have had it as someone who is, you know, a geographical thinker, a critical thinker. So I'm hoping that what we're going to do here is stay neutral, stay analytical, and make sure we've got this geographical lens. Okay, so Alistair, welcome back. Alistair's one of my co-hosts for Espresso and Geography. Just quickly, how are you doing, Alistair? You keeping cool over there in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, keep well, kid. Yeah, it's been hot over here, but given our position a little bit further to the west and a little bit closer to the ocean than you guys, it hasn't been quite as bad. We normally intercept a lot of the rain that comes in off the Atlantic before it hits Great Britain. So we
Yeah.
do our service there. So I think the payoff is that we don't quite get the extreme temperatures that you've had, but it's still been high 20s.
Mm.
So very, very hot in the classrooms.
Yeah. So for context, folks, so if you're not in the UK and you're listening from abroad, this kind of conversation will be relevant for you anywhere in the world, because the whole, climate change is impacting the whole globe. Actually, Europe is one of the fastest heating continent on the planet. We're heating up more than any else. And so what we've just had this week in June in the UK was really hot. Places got up to mid to high 30s. So once again, we were approaching 40 degrees Celsius. Last time that happened for the first time in recorded history was July 2022. That was supposed to be a 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year event with current climate. And now it's, on the verge of potentially happening again. And then the big debate came from the fact that schools do we close for the heat wave, right? Do we close? And then there's a huge public debate from parents about, well, if teachers just want a day off, or my child doesn't feel comfortable in schools, it's too hot in schools, or they're just going to be just as hot at home, all this, and like loads of people coming on from very valid points, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to some clips from the Teacher Talk Radio debate, and then Alistair and I are going to react to them on a, hopefully through in pure coffee and geography style, right? So through a geographical lens. So I'm going to put the first two clips we're going to do, Alistair. We'll do one at a time, but the first two clips we're going to do is talking about the infamous heat wave of 1976, because one of the things that's been brought up in this debate is, 1976, that was 50 years ago, and we got through that, and all this kind of stuff. Kids are not resilient anymore, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to listen to this, and we're going to put a little bit of a geographical lens through it. So I'm just going to add this here, folks, and hopefully we'll be able to hear it. And Alistair, you can put your thumbs up if you can or can't hear it, okay? If you can hear it, we'll just let it play. All right, so who you're going to hear, folks, is someone called Alan. Alan is a head teacher in the UK, and he has a very strong point of view with regards to 1976.
So in 1976, it was hotter than it is now, but everyone got on with it. So we've stayed open yesterday, we stayed open today. It's hot, of course it's hot, but they're hot in school, they're hot at home. And I just think that, I can say to you, in the last 2 days in Caldicot, they haven't learned much about Macbeth. They haven't learned much about Oxbow Lakes. They haven't learned much about, the periodic table. What they've learned is the hidden curriculum, resilience, getting on with it. You push through is the real world. Farmers.
Okay, so Alistair, so I want, he goes on a little bit more to talk about kind of general resilience, farmers getting on with it, all this kind of stuff. But let's just focus on the 1976 element of this, because what this does, this introduces a temporal comparison, right? Which we do a lot in geography, comparing different times with similar geographies. And of course, it sets up this classic memory versus data tension. The fact that our memories, are biased, they are based on emotion and they fixate on certain things. And that tends to be in contradiction to scientific facts, which is why a lot of science, can be seen as ideological because it goes against what we inherently feel as human beings, right? So a couple of things really, as to think about is, or how reliable are historical comparisons when thinking about climate change, and what does geography say about changing baselines? Just not necessarily in geography, or what, in climate. What about in general? So, looking through a historical lens, what do we think about that from a geographical point of view?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. This really does bring me up short when they talk about this being 50 years ago, because I remember the summer of 1976. I was 7 at the time, so you can do the math and work out what age I am now. So I remember it, and I was over in England that summer. So having just said in Northern Ireland, it's normally a little bit cooler than England. I was over in England visiting my aunt. I remember vividly one of these core memories of seeing my first dust devil ever as a wee lad from Northern Ireland, because it was so hot. And then in my mind, back at the time, I was seeing this tornado. I don't know, maybe that's the seeds of my geographical fascination. But I do remember it. And part of the reason why I remember it is because it was so unusual. And I think that's one of the first things you want to say whenever we're looking at these events now that are happening. And sadly, the term the new normal is much more appropriate. So yes, it was hot, but one of the things that is really important, I think, to do in this debate is to make sure that we get beyond just merely anecdote and personal memory. I mean, I could tell you stories about 1976, but geographers, although we lean into stories and anecdote and experiences, of course, that's part of what it means to collect geographical data. When it comes to something like this, we need to have the data. To use that well-trod phrase, anecdote is not the singular of data or evidence. Anecdotes are important. They're part of personal narratives, but if we're going to evidence, we need to move beyond those. So just to state clearly, it wasn't hotter in 1976. As a point of fact, it wasn't hotter in 1976. I think part of the big challenge then was the duration of it. And the fact also that it was drier. I mean, I remember a lot of the stuff that was coming out then about the standpipes in the streets and the advertisements that we should share bathwater, which to a 7-year-old seemed like absolutely horrific prospect.
And those things really etch themselves in the memory, don't they? And that's what makes them very powerful.
I think you're right. And that's why a lot of people, especially those that lived through it, are turning back to it. We just got on with it because they are very unusual. And that's the key point. But once you start to put in the facts, what you're looking at, I've just got some of the evidence here sitting beside me. The 5 warmest UK summers on record now are all 2025, 2018, 2006, 2003, 2022. And that's the evidence. That's not anecdote. And it's really important to set that in timescale, or set that in that framing. You'll also notice in terms of the timescale that they're all very recent. So what we're seeing here is a recent change in the trends. And that's, I think, where the understanding of the difference in weather and climate is so important for geographers. 1976 was a weather event, what we're seeing over the last 10, 20 years is a fundamental shift in the climate that makes these weather events a lot more common. And I notice as well as time, you're introducing another great geographical concept through the map. I've been showing this a lot online as well, which is scale. So over to you to talk about the map.
Yeah, so if you could see here, folks, if you're watching, if you're listening, I'll describe it to you. But we've got two global maps. They're what we call temperature anomaly maps. So that it's the difference between a base. It doesn't really matter what the baseline is, so long as it's the same for both maps, right? So you've got two temperature anomaly maps, and one of them says at the top. This is from the University of Reading. So one at the top is you see lots of cool blues all over the place, but you do see wisps of reds, and then there clearly is kind of a red spot across the United Kingdom and northern France, right? And where we're talking about roughly 2 degrees above the baseline. And then on the bottom map, you've got the summer of 2025, because we've got a whole temperature record for the summer of 2025. That's why it doesn't say summer of 2026. But what this does show by comparison, and if you look at the same maps for 24, 23, 22, 21, blah, 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 blah. So you can't say, oh yeah, but you've cherry picked 2025. But you can look at any summer map from the 2000s, 2020s, right? And you'll see exactly the kind of same pattern, is that almost the entire globe is red. Okay, so with the same baseline. So the globe, so on a scale, it's all warmed up. And you can see there, again, you've got the UK is in red, warmer actually than it was in 1976, but you can also see Spain's in red, almost all of southern Europe, lots of France. You see big patches of northern Russia, across West Asia, the Western United States, so you can actually see there's no comparison in terms of spatial patterns. So that's what Alex just said. 1976 was a weather event. And in fact, if you were to bring that heat wave in 1976 to today, the people at University of Reading and Met Office, all that kind of say, and that heat wave would be 3 degrees warmer today. So that kind of gives you a kind of like a feeling for that. So what I'm going to do now, Alistair, is I'm going to go on to a next clip and kind of like where I came in on this. So so this is a clip where I basically talked about what we just said, and the questions I want to ask you about is, what do we actually mean by baseline shift, and why do small average changes like this cause these events that we're having? So here's my response to Alan after I was able to give my contribution. Yeah, so just for context, people who don't know me, I work at the Tyndall Centre Research for Climate Change at the University of St. I'm also an ex-teacher for 13 years, so I've kind of got a foot in both camps. So first of all, I respect Alan's point of view. Unfortunately, that's a false equivalence with regards to the 1973. What people have got to remember, of course, yes, there's all these pictures of children playing outside, hoses in the street, but also, they also tend not to remember the water shortages, the wildfires, the failed harvest, the heat illness, and the deaths from 1973 either. And the other thing as well, so I've just got 4 points to make. So first of all, the baseline climate has changed, right? So a 1976 style event today would not be the same event. In fact, the Met Office has just done, and University Research has just done a piece of research for the 50th anniversary of the 1976 heat wave, and a comparable event today would be 3 degrees hotter in today's climate. Okay, so that was kind of my rebuttal, and basically when it comes to biases and things like that, I try to name them because I think it's good for me, so I can recognize biases amongst myself. So I said it was a false equivalence to compare 1976 with this one. So, but I mean, what a lot of people don't understand, Alistair, and it can be quite difficult to get your head around it, especially when you've got such an emotive thing around mem stuff like that. But why is it, things like small average changes lead to these very large extremes that we're seeing today?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I often find whenever I'm trying to explain certain figures to my pupils, I'm still a geography teacher, being a geography teacher for 33 years. So some numbers in and of themselves sound big. I'm massively into plate tectonics and geology, and I have a lovely rock collection at the front of my room. And when I hold up a rock that I've collected from the north coast of Northern Ireland, I say to the people, this is 500 million years old. That sounds and feels like a big number. But whenever you get into stuff like when I'm talking about climate biomes and talking about rainfall totals, I'll say to them at the start, no matter how much drama I try to introduce in my voice, I'm actually not going to convince you this is big, because the units are millimeters. I mean, millimeters are the tiniest little unit you can get in a ruler. Nobody thinks of millimeters being big, right? So it's trying to help them to understand what these figures are like and what they mean. And the way that I've fallen into doing that over the years is to get them to think about how much energy it would require to ... So how much energy would it require to boil a kettle of water? So we start with something that's very tangible for them, right? You can do that relatively quickly. You boil a kettle in a couple of minutes, you get yourself your little cup of coffee, right? Versus how much energy would it be if you put on the heater to heat enough water for a bath? Well, it's going to take a little bit longer, isn't it? Because you're going to need a lot more energy. How much energy would it take to heat a swimming pool? And I just begin to scale it up like that, because it's then a case of, right, imagine if you're taking, well, let's say we talk about the North Atlantic, for example, when we raise the temperature of the North Atlantic by 0.5 degree, how much water are you heating? How much energy would that require, even though it's only 0.5 degree? And I find that moving from something that's a little bit more tangible and just scaling it up gets them to realize that even though we're talking about small numbers, the amount of energy, because of the scale and the size of what you're heating, the amount of energy required to do that is incredible and considerable. And therefore, if you're introducing that amount of extra energy into the entire climate atmosphere system of our planet, you're talking about introducing an incredible amount of extra energy, instability, heat, storms, and so forth. So it's really just about trying to move beyond that notion of it's only 0.5 degree, or it's only 3 degrees, or whatever figure it might be, the relevant. Doesn't sound like much. The temperature in any given day in a location could vary that amount. But if you're doing that at the scale at which we're seeing it happen, and the impact that can have. So I've just found that to be a useful little way of helping them understand. So when we're talking about shifting a baseline up of the energy of our entire planet has gone up by whatever the figure is at the moment, 1.2, 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, to get us to that level for the entire planet is an incredible amount of energy, and it's going to have an incredible impact, and already is having that impact.
Yeah, I mean, if you also want another analogy, folks, I mean, it's not directly comparable. It kind of gives you an idea. If you think of the bottom of a kettle, you know, with the heating element, you know, you think of the surface area of that element, or however it is, and you're only heating enough water for a couple of cups of tea or something like that. You know, think about how much energy, you know, you're talking about a couple of kilowatts, perhaps even more, of energy going in. You know, you see your meat, if you've got that one of those old meters, your meter spins around pretty quickly, or if you've got one of the newer kind of energy monitors, you'll see it go up to the red and stuff like that. That is a huge amount of energy that's going in just to heat that one little bit of water, right? And of course, yeah, I know it's heating it from, say, room temperature up to 100, so, and we're only talking about a couple of degrees. So, but if you now think the entire planet's worth of a reservoir, because that's what the atmosphere is, it's a reservoir, right? It's a reservoir of air. Then if to enable to do that across the entire planet, you need to now think about the amount of energy just to do that just by a couple of degrees, right? So that's another way to think about it. You know, something I actually thought about now that I didn't think about during the chat, during the radio interview, was there's also something called shifting baseline syndrome. And what this is, folks, is that we tend to kind of bring ourselves up to make what is happening right now the norm, and then we kind of judge everything based on this new normal. So the only problem we've got now is because this is now happening more often, there's a lot of kind of aspect is oh, you know, it's just the heat again. It's just the heat. We'll get over it. We know last year it was fine. We got through it last year. We got it through. It's fine. And now we're judging ourselves based on this new baseline. You know, so we now need an even higher bar to treat this as an emergency and the health risk that it is, until that becomes the norm, and then we come back up here, and now we are thinking, well, what about? So that's something that's also taking place, is this shift in kind of like baseline syndrome. And that's very, very dangerous, because the human body starts shutting down at certain air temperatures and certain humidity, certain wet bulb temperatures. It doesn't matter where the baseline is. Our bodies are built for certain, for a certain way. And because the climate is changing so rapidly, it's taken us the whole of human history to be used to a relatively stable climate, right? Of course, there's been the Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, all that kind of stuff. Of course, there's been, but they have been relatively very slow, gradual changes. They're not like the sharp kind of things happening right now. So that's also to bear that in mind, is the rate of change is so important, and we can't. And it really is, I guess, the boiling frog syndrome, really, isn't it? It's like the frog sitting there thinking, "All right, I'm used to it now," but it's 3 degrees hotter than it was, and then a couple of moments later, it's now 4 degrees. Well, I'm all right, I'm used to it now, but that frog is starting to suffer. But it's all right, I'm used to this, and then it just keeps going up and up and up. I'm going to go for a third clip now. We're going to move on to the safeguarding framing now. This is obviously something that a lot of you know I am very, very passionate about. And I've brought a lot more of this element into my research at the Tyndall Centre, is that I don't think I've told you this, Alistair. I've actually now got a couple of papers under editorial review about this work. Ooh. So we'll see. We'll wait and see. I don't want to count my chickens yet. But yeah, so let's have a look at the safeguard lens. And this was the argument I was trying to bring in, right? I wanted to focus on child safeguarding, have that more nuanced approach rather than just what the temperature says outside. So this is my entry into that, kind of like what I tried to do to bring this into the discussion. I just want you to think about maybe risk, how geographers define risk, Alistair. So let's just listen to this a little bit. Guidance and duties, and my research is actually about how climate change is a school safeguarding and issue and a child wellbeing issue. So I've got a lot of expertise in this area. And the thing is that the DfE's own climate risk summary suggests that overheating affects learning when the indoor temperature reaches 35 degrees, and learning can become very, very difficult. And when you've got the UK HSA saying children are vulnerable to heat and a red heat health alert, this doesn't just mean children need to suck it up at school. It also means that there's a risk to life even for healthy population. And I was at an event up in Norfolk for these last couple of weeks, and there were actually children fainting, and it was probably cooler in that tent that I was in rather than in the classroom for some of them. And my last one, just before I give way, is the We Cope Then is not a safeguarding standard by any stretch of the imagination, right? So anecdote is not risk assessment. So for example, HSC, they say that heat is a workplace hazard. So why that should apply to adults and not apply to children is a bit worrying, actually, to hear that from a head teacher, to be honest. Okay, so I guess I just want to talk about this element of risk and what happens when we base policy on anecdote, basically. So I just really want your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, I noted down when I was watching these clips before we started, the line that you used there, Kit, I thought was superb. We Cope Then is not a safeguarding standard. We'll probably go on to discuss the whole notion of resilience and what that might look like from a geographical point of view. But even before we get to that, even if that's what, if we do get some kind of agreement that that's a good thing to try to have as part of, I think Alan mentioned earlier, the hidden curriculum of the school. Regardless of that, We Coped Then is not a safeguarding standard. I've already said that I was a child in the 1970s. We did not have seat belts in the back of cars in the 1970s. When my uncle picked me up with my cousins, we all sat in the boot of his estate car, thinking we were having the best trip ever. And you know what? We never had an accident. We're all still here. That wasn't a risk, was it? We coped then. No,
but the thing is that you're alive to remember
exactly,
that you never had
and it's survivor bias. We're talking about bias, isn't it? I mean, I was fine, didn't affect me, therefore there's no problem. It just reveals and too narrow a mindset, as you say, is based on anecdote. Yes, if God forbid, a car had come into the back of us in that estate car in the 1970s, I don't think We Cope Then would have been the line that we would have been using. We were lucky, that was all. But what we've done is we've learned from that, and we've made cars much safer. We've got seatbelts, we've got regulations, we've got laws that keep things and people safe. And I think that's so crucial moving forward into this. And you're framing, you're the first person that I heard mention this as climate change as a safeguarding issue. I think is an incredibly powerful and important framing, because what it does is positions this as a, how do we protect all children, but particularly how do we protect those that are most vulnerable. So to position that as safe lining, I think, is the most important starting point in this conversation.
Yeah, and in all fair, I got the sense from Alan and Rich, definitely I got the sense that they do care about their kids. I really got that sense from it, and I think the kind of the frustrating thing for me is that I could see where he's coming from. I was just like, and it was a case of, yeah, but you've got, it's not just about gritting through and bearing it. That is not a way to safeguard your kids. But I could tell you really, really care for your kids. And he did talk about later on about how they kind of like didn't have a normal day. They got an ice cream truck on site and things like that, and water fights, which is fantastic. And I was like, wouldn't that be lovely? Because then it turns a potential devastating situation at school where some kids have had to go to hospital because of heat exhaustion, or it turns, could be a really tragic memory to something that was quite fun. And what worries me with that, and I mean, this is not a fault of Anne. I thought, my person, any head teacher who'd done that kind of thing is doing the right thing, and especially trying to keep the kids in school, right? My worry is that, well, actually, I don't suppose I'm worried about it, because the tragic thing is that this is going to happen more often, right? So there is a risk, shall we say, there is a risk that the kids are going to remember this event fondly because of the ice cream trucks and the water, which is right, which is what should happen. Because in my kids' primary school, they were splashing around with water and had their feet in their stationary trays full of water to stay cool while they were trying to do some lessons, right? So, and that's great. That's great reactionary adaptation, right? And that all that stuff should happen. But we also need to communicate to these kids is that this is not usual. And, we've been put in a situation in our schools where I can't keep you as safe as I'd like you to be and get on with learning as we want to get learning on, because I would love to have a school classroom. I'd love to have, air conditioning that is solar powered so we can stay cool and we can stay safe. That would be amazing, So, I very much sympathized with a lot of what Alan said with that kind of stuff. Because what do you do? I mean, think of the pressures of the job that he's got, bless him, and Rich has got. We'll come back to Rich in a minute. Rich made a fantastic point. But what about this whole thing, though, Alistair, about the fact that how geographers define risk. So the way that I was trying to come across, and I was left with no room to give this point, right, was this geographical way of coming up with risk. And I'm talking about things, people like Professor Ilan Kelman, for instance. There is no such thing as a natural disaster. It's all about human choice. So I actually had ready something to go about to bring Ilan Kelman's work into the discussion. I said to kind of give this kind of thing about human choices is what really causes a disaster, not really, the heat itself. But I didn't get that opportunity to kind of bring that in. So what's your point about with kind of like, how geographers define risk, and how could that be different, maybe also enhance lived experiences, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned human choice, because you can look at that on both sides, because there is this whole idea of how much agency any one of us has as an individual, right? So in a sense, what we're facing this past week as the new normal is the result of the collective human choices that we have made as individuals, but particularly as systems. I think that's another important element of all of this. This is as much to do with the systems within which we live as anything. But having got to that point, we then have the implications of that falling on a lot of people, many of whom don't have much by way of choice. Children and young people have to come to school. It's the law. And whenever they come to the school, how safe is that environment for them? So how do geographers frame this? Well, of course, it's one of the ways we could talk about that's the classic equation we'll use, that risk equals hazard times vulnerability times exposure. There's a couple of other elements in there that the hazard alone is not what determines the risk. And those vulnerability dimensions, how susceptible are the children and young people that we're facing or that we're teaching in light of all of this, and particularly given the fact that they haven't choice. And when you broaden this out beyond schools, the social justice dimensions of this, you see almost every newspaper headline or online headline still has the tension between the catastrophic language, and there will almost inevitably a photograph of people eating an ice cream or at a beach.
Yes.
Because if you are more socioeconomically enabled, if you have access to a car, if you've got the freedom to move, if you live close to the sea, yes, you can go and do all of these things. But what if you don't have a car? What if you live in the top of a high-rise block of flats where the temperature might be 10 degrees higher than it is at the surface with no through flow? What if you work in the service industries, in the kitchen, where you can't get away? And this social justice dimension of what amplifies the hazard to produce the risk is largely as a result of people ending up in contexts and situations where they don't have that same degree of choice. So back again to the schools, and we'll probably talk about this later on in terms of how we can begin to adapt our buildings, but how is it that we are making those places as safe as possible? And yes, you're right, the memories that you can create. I mean, we've the same. We had ice creams. I brought my guitar along. We sat outside. We have a covered quad in the middle of the school around the corridors go, and we just had a sing song over break time. Just took requests, and you just lean into this and try and make this as good an experience for the kids as possible. But in the midst of all
for me,
of that,
that's resilience. That's resilience. Alistair.
Yes,
that's what I think is resilient, and being clear to the children that this is what resilience is, not the stoic stiff upper lip, get through it, suck it up, buttercup. More of a case of, look, we've adapted the day for you. This is not to try and keep you happy, keep you cool, and adaptation is resilience. It's one of the key components of resilience, right? That's what makes up the climate resilience is the combination of mitigation and adaptation for everybody in a social climate justice way. And so, what Alan did at his school was brilliant. And what needs to happen is to say, look, what we've done as a school, or ice cream trucks, was like that. It's not just you can have a laugh and a fun and a joke. It's our way of building resilience in you, that you have to adapt and you have to cope to, ride out these dangerous situations. Yeah. So for me, I think you've just hit on the exact thing of what actually we should mean by resilience.
Yeah. I agree.
So that's brilliant. No, fantastic. And in fact, let's move on. Yeah, let's move on to about the material of the school. So let's bring in Rich now. Oh, by the way, before I bring in Rich, I don't think I've set aside some clips with Maud or Lucy, but Maud made a lot of points on the social justice element. So folks, please, make sure you hear to the bits that she mentioned. And Lucy did mention about, like, people still have to go to work, farmers on tractors. I think, please forgive me if I'm wrong, Lucy, but you said something along like your daughter used to work in the kitchen. It gets really hot in there, or she does work in the kitchen and stuff like that. And they were very valid points, and then I think there was Rich, Maud and I were kind of saying, well, yeah, but, people going to work with, compared to kids having to go to school, they're not exactly comparable. So, and there are there are workplace safety protocols and stuff like that. So, but please, folks, I don't want you to think I'm cherry picking clips, because I'm going to encourage you to watch the whole thing or listen to the whole thing if you can. All right. So let's bring in Rich now, folks. So Rich is going to talk now about the reality in the classroom that he experienced. Okay.
And Maud. And from our own perspective, in being in the building for the last 4 days, I'm in a halfway house here. I get what Alan's saying, and in dealing with the parents that I've been dealing with and the staff I've been dealing with, I'm almost conflicted with what my own impression of this. First and foremost, the most important aspect of this all is kid safety. Our building was built in 1931. It's on numerous floors. In the top floor of our building, we're talking in them classrooms up to 39 degrees. So I get it. The bottom line, what the points Kit is making is absolutely bang on. First and foremost, are the kids safe? If they're not safe, then your school should not be open. That's 100% where we are. And if we think anything other than that, then I'd be extremely worried. I'm going to come back to your point in a minute, Alan, because I get on board, Alan, what you're saying a lot there. But it's also about common sense as well. It's also about making sure that kids are looked after, people are safe. It's also clear communication with all stakeholders. So one of the biggest things we did this week, fundamentally, it was about the uniform. So it's not just opening your top button up, which is absolute nonsense. It's about making sure, that the rooms are fit for purpose, which I...
Okay. And listen to the rest of, Alan's points there. So he was talking about uniform, about the rooms being fit for purpose, which is largely out of the school's control, and the top levels of his school building were 39 degrees Celsius, which is, I mean, I in my house, I mean, I've done my very, very best to kind of adapt this house. It's 1927 detached, but we've tried our best to kind of, you know, adapt it for the climate that's coming. But even upstairs in our house, it was 30 degrees last night, and that was really uncomfortable. So 39, you know, and bless what you had, he had to adjust for there with Rich. And then he talked about, the fact that a lot of the buildings are just not fit for purpose nowadays. So yeah. Why are school buildings so vulnerable to heat and Alistair? What have we done to kind of leave ourselves in these situations where they're just not coping today, let alone for what the environment is coming, the climate that's coming our way?
Yeah, there's certainly a cultural thing, and I really hope out of what's happened in the last few years that despite all of the ongoing comments that you get online with the 1976 recoup then, that the penny is beginning to finally drop, that we need to take adaptation seriously. The two main ways of framing how we cope with the climate crisis is very often mitigation to try and reduce the causes, and adaptation, how we cope with the impacts. And we just haven't been taking adaptation seriously, largely because again, teaching 34 years, Kit, I mean, when I started teaching it, I was teaching climate change almost as a future thing. I've taught in the same school the entire career, actually. So I'm now teaching the children of the kids I taught in the 90s. And I remember saying to them in the 90s, I was saying, we're doing this for our children, for our children's children. That was the framing of sustainability then. And I'm now saying to them, look, we talked about you in this school in the 1990s. Have we done right by you? Have we really made the choice better for you? Because, I mean, literally, I named you, not by name, but we talked about you at the time. And I don't think we've taken it seriously enough as a society. And I think this is one of the big wake-up calls, that we need absolute mitigation. We absolutely need to do that. But there is an urgent need now for adaptation. It struck me as I was thinking about this, one of the things, sadly, that we had to do in and around about our school earlier on this year was to cut down some really old trees that are maybe 100, 200 years old, for safety reasons. And I'll tell you why, kids, because one of them fell down across the road outside the front of the school about 3 or 4 years ago during one of the really, really intense winter storms. And clearly this was about half an hour after the start of school. If that had happened when the kids were arriving, that would have been
seriously
hugely disastrous. Now, the question is, why did it fall down in the storm? Well, of course, that's a climate change story, isn't it? Part of climate change is that our winters are going to be stormier, and we've had a lot more storms and a lot more risk. So part of the risk that we now face around our school is that some of the trees could come down. So to mitigate, or so to adapt to that risk, we had to cut down the trees, which means that during the summer, to adapt to the heat risk, we have actually lost some of our adaptation. So sorry, that is not a story of what has happened, but it's I hope a story of the realization that this needs to be a wake-up call. We need to take adaptation seriously. And if we have gone to the lengths of actually bringing in tree surgeons to remove trees so that they don't fall during the winter storms that are a result of climate change, if we're going that far, we absolutely need to be taking seriously how we adapt schools. And that is back to the systems within which we live. That's back to, because that's going to require incredible funding from central government. That's not something that can fall on school leaders and heads, because the cost and the scale of it is far too great. But for every year that we delay taking proper action in adapting our schools for this new normal is another year where we'll have exactly the same conversation over and over again. Are we going to send the kids home? Oh, I remember 1976. We need to start adapting. Now, of course, the saying is the best time to take action was, the first best time to take action was 20 years ago. The next best time to take action is right now.
Right now. Absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen like parts of schools, new builds going up, or whole schools being completely rebuilt yet, and they've got like huge, massive south-facing glass windows without any awnings to go over the top. They are, it's just there's no way in terms of water. There's no sustainable drainage systems going in. you know, and you've got big skylights which are amazing to let the natural light in, fantastic, but there's no way of dissipating the heat through them when the heat gets trapped inside, and it's just absolutely beggars belief. And it's just like, so money is being spent, there is money out there clearly to rejuvenate, redo, rebuild school or parts of schools or something like that, but it is just not climate, it's not climate literate. It's just not, you know, it's really, really, really bizarre. So and like, I really also encourage people to look at the previous chat that me and you had regarding, you know, your tree projects, your GIS tree project, you know, about the way that the kids can get involved with this and ensure, you know, and having a say about, well, what does tree cover do for us? And so these kind of things can involve the kids, you know, as well, so which can build agency and whatnot. So I really would recommend people to look at that. So now you mentioned about the nuance, right? And this is the other thing, because we got to about almost half an hour, Tom did a little bit of the beginning before we started, so it was more like 20 minutes. Like 20 minutes in, and I was being painted as someone who says shut the schools down completely, right? And I never said that once in the whole entire thing. That's not what I said about. It's not, as it is with geography or anything, it's never a binary, right? Yeah. So here's a bit of a clip with me, folks, talking about the nuances of safeguarding and, you know, what actually is good safeguarding
in extremes of temperatures.
Can I so not once in my kind of response to Alan did I say that school should close. If you listen back, I did not say that at all. And I totally agree with both you and Alan that children are better off in school from a safeguarding point of view. So let's just remind you, like, my expertise is in safeguarding and things like this. So let me just give people listening an example, and I think where Alan and Lucy will totally agree with this. So first of all, I don't have these rose-tinted glasses that all kids can go home to air condition. Actually, my research is all about the most vulnerable and those who are suffering the most from climate change, who do live in poorly insulated houses, low-income areas. So actually, I'm keenly aware, and I work with those children. So if I give you an example, if a school totally closing or totally staying open is not really, you know, is really, it can't work that way, to be honest. So what really has happened, and it's not Alan's fault or Rich's fault, they're doing the best they can and they will always look after their children, right? But the trouble is, as Rich said, you know, they're in poorly built schools that are not fit for today's climate, let alone tomorrow's climate. So let's just give an example. Let's say Alan decided to shut his school, right? But the trouble is with that, some of those kids are going to go back home and they're going to be going into hotter conditions. They might not be able to regulate themselves, so their behavior and could be, you know, even more dysregulated. They might even, if a child might be known to Alan, where if they go home, they might not be going to a safe environment because the heat will dysregulate the adult's behavior, and that can put them at risk. Yeah. So totally shutting schools is not even the answer, because you actually could be putting kids at greater risk. And every person who works in education has a duty of contextual safeguarding as well. And what that means is that you might not be able to directly control the child's circumstances, but you can do whatever you can to promote protective factors. So that's I just wanted to give like just an example, and I'm, you know, this wasn't an anecdotal example. You know, there is evidence out there that shows during the time of heat, you know, you start getting a rise in violent behavior, disruptive behavior. You know, that's documented, right? You think about, you know, every time there's, well, let's take the World Cup one right now. You know, you've got the combination of booze and heat that tends to really kick things off sometimes with some people, not everybody, with some people. So it's all documented that heat can really dysregulate behavior and control and stuff like that. And so I just want to give that example that schools will know, you know, hopefully because it's been flagged up and social services are aware, schools will know if there are children which it's unsafe to go home because of either the physical conditions, it's just too hot, because of the, as Alan rightly said earlier in actually about the fact that they might be going home to a flat which is 45 degrees, right? Or to an unsafe household because of who else is home, right? And what about those parents who can't come home and look after their child because they have to go to work because they can't rub two pennies together? Right. So so for me, it's not a case of just totally shutting a school or totally keeping it open. And the point I made a bit later was if you can allow the kids who are safe to be at home, go home, and they can identify the kids who will get on with a bit of remote learning and stuff like that. They keep everybody else at school. They're going to have some space to move kids around to the cooler parts of the school. get the ice cream truck in, a bit of water fight, stuff like that, you know. So yeah, really, kind of, Alistair, I mean, we see it all the time in geography, the uneven distribution of stuff.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on that earlier, didn't we, about the social justice issues and this, and it brings us back again to that risk assessment formula: risk is hazard times vulnerability times exposure. And again, I just commend you, Kit, for how you framed that with the nuance that not only you as a geographer will bring, but you as a thoroughly decent human being will bring to understanding all of that. But it is that nuance of, you know, what is it that the kids are exposed to, and where's the safest place for them, and this is where, you know, in terms of the nuance of leadership. I mean, my teacher, my head of geography department, but I'm also in senior leadership for teaching and learning within the school. So, you know, we've got to grapple with these kinds of things. But, you know, just to say that these things are difficult doesn't mean that you can't come up with clever and subtle and nuanced ways of looking at it beyond the binary, keep schools open and shut. And you think back to COVID, for example, and again, the well-documented increase in safeguarding issues whenever kids weren't in schools. And we had a really important visceral reminder of the multifaceted contributions that schools make to bring helping support children and young people beyond just the core educational purposes. And what did we do then? Well, we had a flexible approach, didn't we? You know, for if schools were open for those children and young people for whom schools were the safest place. And I think, you know, we can certainly learn from that as well. Whenever we're considering, you know, where's the greater exposure? Is the greater exposure in school or at home? So there are ways and means of doing this that go beyond the sound bites that maybe sound good when they're clipped for social media. Oh, we need to build resilience. So, you know, we got through 1976. Yeah. Okay. Can we move beyond there to the kind of subtle discussion that you've just outlined? Because that's the really important conversation. We identify the kids that need the support. We provide that support, and schools are able to be flexible in the whole thing. But it does, I think I do need to swing back again to what I said in response to the last clip. That can probably take us so far. The fundamental thing is, and this is what I think we should be clamoring for, is the systemic response to this that goes above the level of the school as an individual unit to what government is doing and what society is clamoring for. You go into social media at the moment, and of course, it doesn't take too long to find the comment, "Oh, teachers just want another day off," kind of thing, as if it's teachers that are making these decisions.
You want to laugh, folks? Look at the TikTok and Facebook comments on the clips. And you know what's really actually just as a side on that, like Tom has put the full episode on Facebook and stuff like that. Hardly any comments on the full one, but hundreds on the clips, right? And I think it's really important that people do take the chance to listen if they can. Again, on the commute while you're cooking dinner, just to get the bigger picture, right? Because I don't want Alan to be painted as, you know, a villain or a hero or anything. I don't want that at all for any of us, right? And I just think we're at risk at that because, again, like, you know, everybody on that call, Alan, Lucy, you know, Maud and Rich, made some really important points that need to be heard. You know, but if you don't listen to the whole thing, you don't get the context and the nuance. So, yeah. But it's fascinating. Yeah, but it's a good kind of social kind of experiment as well. And I know we do a bit of this in geography as well. You know, not to the extent of maybe they do in like psychology and stuff like that. But you know, we do talk about how media frames certain things, and like especially when it comes to, you know, hazards and things like that. So yeah, right. One more clip. I mean, I'm going to, because we actually covered quite a bit, and I don't want another clip of me talking. I think let's get a clip of someone else talking. So let's go back to Rich then, and then about the infrastructure gap. So I just want to end on that, and then we can just give our general thoughts. So if I bring, and then Rich can talk about this infrastructure gap.
Just to go back to the point there that you've raised there, Kit. So I'm going through balance sheets on a daily basis right now as we speak, and Alan will be the same as me. And the points you've made, Kit and Lucy and Maud, are absolutely bang on. The issue we've got here going forward is we've got buildings that are 100 years old. that haven't got aircon, that weren't built for the 2020s. We've got buildings that are designed to keep the heat in. We've got windows that don't open. There's no aircon. So the big worry I've got sat here going forward is how on earth do we create buildings that are fit for purpose in the current climate that we're in now, where me and Alan will be getting plagued to death about cutting a cover bill when we took it, and that'll be our first port of call will be to cut that cover bill or things such as that. And we're talking about buildings that really are possibly 50, 60, 70 years out of date.
You've got a tough job, you two. Yeah. Yeah, and I had so much appreciation, for both Alan and Rich. And I remember being asked if I wanted to come on an internship with SLT, and I was like, I ain't touching that with a barge pole. So, so I don't envy the job that any member of SLT have. So I just, so really, Alice, to kind of like to finish off our reaction to the clips, then what would a climate adapted school look like then? What should we really be aiming for? What should the government be supporting? Head teachers like Alan and Rich and all out there in terms of the fabric of the school, but also about how they can help them with the culture and the behaviour to keep these kids safe. So not just about the material, I guess, but also that too.
Yeah, look, it's almost impossible decision to be making decisions in this context. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. You can't get it right, and it is all about a weighing up of risk. And these decisions are never easy. I've mentioned earlier about systemic stuff, and this is all about fundamental choices, isn't it? At the risk of becoming political, but hey, we've done that before on here, haven't we? It looks like that we've got a new Prime Minister coming quite soon into the UK, and with new Prime Minister will come new policies, new priorities. And this is why I was mentioning earlier that I think the clamouring here shouldn't be directed at teachers who want another day of school. The clamour should be to politicians of how do we make our children and young people safe, how are we prioritising the budgetary spending. We live in a internationally geopolitically unstable time at the moment, so there's a lot of clamoring for defence spending, and if you talk about the difficulties and decisions for principals, if you're making those kinds of decisions, it's incredibly difficult. But surely in the midst of all of this, and back again to your framing, if this is properly safeguarding, we have got to be talking about, right, there's got to be a budget now to start adapting, because adaptation is going to take a little bit of time. If we're talking about planting trees, which you should be part of it, that's you're talking about something 10, 20 years in the future, So you're then talking about things like, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, so others that maybe jump in the comments could talk about some of those things. But yes, you talk about canopies outside. Our buildings are designed to keep the heat in, so you can close your blinds, but that's after the heat has come in. Can we get at the very least some kind of shading on the outside of the windows? Can we be looking at aircon? But aircon, of course, has a carbon footprint. So can we be looking at solar panels and funding those? But there's an interesting.
And what we're going to do with the waste heat as well from the aircon. What will we do from the waste heat from the aircon? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, again, if it's systems thinking,
systems thinking, yeah. So it's just all about seeing those kinds of things, primarily about taking the action now at a system level, thinking about as a society, what do we want our priorities to be, and how important is it that we protect our children and young people. That should not be a difficult question for us to grapple, at least in principle. We should be agreeing as a society they need protecting. And resilience, yes, I think probably our last little chat, there's something I want to say about resilience then, so I'll not steal my own thunder.
Sure.
Yes, I agree with Alan. They need to be taught resilience. Absolutely they do. But it's how we do it. We don't teach them resilience by forcing them to come into buildings that increase their vulnerability, increase their exposure to hazards over which they have no choice. That's not the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, great. So, folks, again, before me and Alistair just kind of like finish off with general thoughts, is that I just want to once again reiterate, please do your best to go and listen to it, even in pieces, stuff like that. There was another bunch of people that came on after us as well. I had to go because I had to do some parenting, but Maud stayed on, Lucy stayed on, and then Tom was joined by Liz, Alistair, and JP, who took the conversation further. So please do try your best to try and listen to the whole thing again in chunks or whatever, at times that makes sense to you. Alistair and I couldn't react for the whole 2 and a bit hours, right? We couldn't sit here and talk about the whole thing like a commentary. That was never going to happen. So, of course, I had to take certain clips. And because I have a podcast, I also have the privilege of the right of reply as well, to kind of like making my point. So, yes, most of the clips would have been of me, because now I've got the chance to elaborate the points that I was trying to make. So to finish off then, Alistair, yeah, so basically your general final thoughts, and because you are so on this with the work that you've done, and I so strongly recommend, again, listen back to previous episodes of Alistair talking about the way he approaches education with shared ed, climate education, GIS, all that kind of stuff. You'll get a sense of where Alistair's coming from. So yeah, I just really want your take in general now, really.
Yeah, thanks, Kit. And I'm going to try and finish with a more positive, optimistic note in terms of, given all these bigger issues and the system issues that I've already addressed that need to be part of it, what is it that those of us that are working with children and young people in schools can actually do to help them with this? Because like you, I agree with Alan's point that we should be teaching them to be resilient. Where I probably take a different view is the how we go about doing that. I was listening to the clip earlier, and I can't remember who said this, but there was somebody who said, I think, if we let them go home, what is this teaching them? I thought that was a really interesting phrase. What are they learning from all of this? What is this teaching them? Because it struck a chord with me in terms of my own journey as a teacher with the children and young people that I teach, because to cover ground similar to what we talked about before with this tree survey that I'm going to talk about now. As a teacher, somebody who teaches the climate crisis, I'm left with this dilemma, because do I teach them the urgency of it? Well, I need to. 1990s, remember I said we're doing this for our children, our children's children. We're now here. This isn't a future potential reality. It is the present new norm. So to delay any further confronting the reality of the challenges we face is just to stick our fingers in our ears and hum a tune whilst everything else goes wrong around us. They need to know the urgency of it at an age and stage appropriate level, of course, but they need to be confronted with that. But of course, as soon as you raise the way down the level of urgency, it can raise up the level of anxiety. It's very well documented, climate anxiety. So I have a safeguarding responsibility for the mental health of my pupils. So how do I balance those two? Do I weigh down with the urgency and raise the anxiety, or do I minimize the anxiety and just pretend that the reality isn't there, and we'll let our children's children deal with it, because it's only going to get worse? And that was the dilemma that I was grappling with a couple of years ago for a shared education project that's a cross-community work. That Northern Ireland is a post-conflict situation with 30 years of peace, but we still have a lot of the intergenerational trauma and the issues that are residual there, and I'm involved in program to try and bridge that gap and bring together young people from across the divide. We had this project and I was grappling with this about how we might try to find a balance. And I got introduced to a paper by Greer and Glacken, which was huge in this because it introduced a third concept for me, and that concept is agency. How do we balance all of this? Well, if you're going to have the urgency on one side, then do you balance the other side with the agency? The agency is the ability to give the young people a sense that they can do something, that the adaptations that they can be involved in can make a difference. So we got, between our shared education partner, something like 780 data points of the young people using GIS to go out into the streets where they lived, using their phones to collect citizen science data about the quality of trees. And of course, there is a very, very strong correlation between multiple deprivation index for locations and the amount of tree cover, social justice dimension to this. And we produced this incredible citizen science project, which gave the young people an amazing sense of agency, but pitched not at just the level of climate crisis is here, we need to do something, here's something you've got to go and recycle more. Well, of course they should recycle, of course they should, but as they put the bottles in the recycling bin, they're going, it's 36 degrees here right now, I don't really think
is this it?
yeah. So we pitched this at the level of, because we had this citizen science data, we were able to go to the local council and get the local council representatives to come along and to meet with our young people so that they could present their concerns to the council and help to shape council policy moving forward. So what does adaptation mean? What does producing resilience amongst our young people mean? Because we must give them the resilience to be able to cope with these pressures of what we're facing. I think it comes through that agency and that adaptation, and it's about schools providing the opportunity for children and young people to be involved in projects at the right scale, small enough to be manageable, but big enough to be meaningful, of getting them to be able to shape the local environment in which they live. And yes, they should be planting trees within their school grounds. They should be engaged with the local council, raising their voices. They should be involved in all of these things, not as citizens of the future, because they're citizens right now and their voices matter as much as anybody. I said earlier on, very often it's framed as children and young people have limited choice in life. Wouldn't it be an amazing gift to promote resilience amongst them if we as educators found a way to platform and amplify their voice in such a way as they feel that they're making a difference? That's the level that I can work at, and that's what I'm committed to.
Yeah, and what a beautiful thing to end on, Alistair. You know, one of the reasons why I bring you on is because your insights are amazing, and you always instill that hope, you know, despite the "this is fine" kind of meme that's going on around us. So, folks, so perhaps this isn't really a question about whether schools should open or close, but a window into something much bigger, which is about balancing risk, responsibility, and adaptation in a changing climate. And as always, the reality is more than just complex headlines, sound bites and clips of a radio show. And this is a conversation that is already important. And, it flummoxes me. It's beggars belief to me that it should become even more important, despite the fact it's at almost peak importance right now, right? So listen, if please hear the full discussion, but also in that, folks, because, I want to say thank you to Alan. I want to say thank you to Lucy, Rich, and Maud, who was on the call with mine. And, really, really thank you so much for that really that great discussion. And I want you folks listening to this, if you're on Facebook, if you're on TikTok, go and comment yourself. Go and also visit the full video, please. Please make sure that Tom and the work that he does at Teach Talk Radio, they get that listening of the whole radio show, not just the clips, right? But also, of course, in this video as well, please, can we have your comments on here, on LinkedIn, on Blue Sky? If you just do hashtag Coffee Jog Pod, perhaps also add the hashtag UK Heatwave as well, then we'll pick those up. So Alistair, my wonderful, wonderful friend and espresso and coffee co-host, although we've probably, this is an hour, so that's the equivalent of 4 espressos. But it's always lovely to have you on. Yeah. And I hope you enjoyed, folks, this special one-off episode, and we'll be back to quote unquote normal programming next time, which is in 2 weeks' time. So bye from me, bye from Alistair, and keep jogging.